Welcome to this discussion on analytical perspectives on the Bach cantatas. Our three contributors today will speak on three different analytical aspects. Daniel Melamed will focus on the music of the cantatas, Ruth Tatlow on the theology, and John Butt on their performance practices. The curious subtitle, How We Got Into This Kind of Analysis and How to Get Out, is a parody of two classic texts from music criticism and analysis, the first by Joseph Kerman, published in 1980, and the second by Kofi Agawu in 2004. So today we will consider some of the same issues in relation to our treatment of the Bach cantatas. Without further ado, let's hear from Dan on analyzing the music.
I want to suggest, to get us started, that the analysis and interpretation of Bach cantatas is badly broken, especially for its reliance on an approach to analyzing and interpreting the cantatas that seems to be pretty much taken for granted, but turns out to be based on a very particular and, I would say, historically dubious aesthetic. I want to show you, as briefly as I can, something about where this approach came from, demonstrate to you that it really does persist, and then, if there is time, begin to suggest a way out of this broken system. I want to suggest that the model for pretty much all cantata analysis in the 20th and 21st centuries has been Albert Schweitzer, particularly drawing on his study of Bach's music, published successively in French, German, and English in 1905, 1908, and 1911, with revisions and modifications by the author in each of the languages. You cannot put these three down next to each other and expect to find exactly the same content. It's slightly dizzying. He spends several chapters extensively establishing the aesthetic foundation for his approach to interpreting and analyzing Bach music. There is no time to go into that here. You'll have to come hear a longer version of this talk. Suffice to say that he is positioning Bach and Bach's way of working musically. He's positioning it very clearly against Wagner. And you might note that the preface to the first edition, the French edition, has a well-known, the preface to that first French edition is by Charles Widor, and that should tell you something about the aesthetic orientation of this. Analysis of Bach, Schweitzer laments, has missed the expressive element. He says that Philipp Spitta, really the only person to deal extensively with cantatas, is, in his words, embarrassed by this expressive element. And he writes that analyses fail just at the point where the analyst should look for the inmost connection between the poetic thought and Bach's musical expression. They've missed, as do all that Bach music represents, not so much a generalized emotional state as one woven out of concrete musical ideas. Everybody misses, he says, that Bach's music is woven out of concrete musical ideas. Bach is, in a number of ways, a direct opposite of Wagner. In this respect, Wagner is the poetic musician, his title notwithstanding. Bach is representative of what he calls pictorial music. Now, Schweitzer sees this realized musically in particular musical motives. They are mostly rhythmic, and they appear and reappear in all the vocal music and, in fact, in the instrumental music as well, where from piece to piece and from vocal to instrumental genres, they retain the same meanings across pieces. Bach's musical language, he writes, is simply based on the fact that for the representation of certain feelings, he prefers certain definite rhythms, and that this association is so natural that it at once tells its own story to anyone with a musical mind. Schweitzer goes on to identify 20 or 25 such ideas. Some of them, as for example, the ones you see at the top, are pictorial, representing serpents, angels, and water. But they're also conceptual, rising, falling, walking, hurrying, and abstract, representing faith, strength, tumult, weariness, solemnity, terror. He's got 20 or 25 of these. They, to him, represent a vocabulary, and, he says, a key to decoding Bach's vocal and instrumental music. Let me show you an example, and that example is the first movement of Cantata 39, Brich dem Hungrigen dein Brot. BWV 39, Movement 1. Schweitzer offers this as an example of Bach's representation of movement. Now, in this opening idea, the opening ritornello, Spitta very clearly hears the breaking of bread, bricht den Hungrigen dein Brot, and let me just play you a little bit of this. So here's the ritornello. So Spitta hears the breaking of bread, and so on. And in Spitta's view, the fact that Bach continues this motive, these eighth note motives, into the next section and text demonstrates how far Bach is, Spitta says, from triviality. And he means here, und die so in Elend sind. And then that motive will continue in the instruments even as the text moves on and offer succor to those who are in exile or in agony. Now, Schweitzer calls this explanation that Bach deviates from the trivial by continuing this motive, he calls it an excuse. And he says both the explanation of this as breaking of bread and this excuse are wrong. There is no worse reproach, he writes, than saying Bach retained a picture in music beyond its necessity. And he also says no one who listens to the music can take it to be a picture of the breaking of bread. It is instead a march, Schweitzer says, the march depicting wretched ones who were being supported and led into the house. Bach's real thought is not always the most direct and obvious. The idea is strongly pictorial in essence, but it is a picture of a situation. These are the terms in which analysts and interpreters have since worked. Let me show you some examples. That is, they take motives that they associate with particular images, and they consider them to be consistent from piece to piece, and they look for a governing idea that Bach brings to the text that reveals his subtle pictorial approach. The method is almost never questioned, just the correctness or incorrectness of a particular interpretation along these lines. The clear error is William Gillies Whitaker. On this movement, he turns immediately to a pictorial question. Spitta and Schering see in this the breaking of bread, Schweitzer the tottering of the weak. The first form of this motive, he says, is associated with the word hungry, the despairing appeal of starving refugees. Sopranos and altos sing an infinitely tender theme, pathetically broken by rest after the first and third words, imitated by tenors and basses. Emotion chokes the voices of the merciful. Again, still pictorial. And Whitaker picks up another interpretive tendency, that is, regarding Bach cantatas as personal expressions of the composer. Spitta took Cantata 39 to be a composition marking the arrival in 1732 in Leipzig of Protestant exiles from Salzburg, and he called it an affecting picture of Christian love, softening with tender hand and pitying sympathy the sorrow of the brethren and attaining the highest reward. Whitaker says Bach's heart was touched to the core by the sight of the forlorn and suffering people. And this is the other strand of Bach cantata interpretation. That is, as Bach as personal expressive artist through this music. A more recent practitioner, John Eliot Gardner. We have seen how rarely the musical setting of a cantata movement is driven exclusively by the semantic sense of the words, he writes. Instead, Bach often surrounds them with his own private code of emphasis of matching affects. And then talking about the various sections of this piece, just where you might expect the Oxfam appeal, you get the begging bowl itself. Bach writes his chorus not from the position of the appeals director, but from that of the famine victim. In other words, he is engineering a movable role for his choir, from members of a caste to biblical instructors laying down rules for appropriate charitable behavior. And this is found all over the internet. Here's Juan Mincham, jazzbachcantatas.com, and it goes immediately to Schweitzer, citing one of Bach's motives of exhaustion, in a comparative piece in Cantata 125, Schweitzer is probably somewhat nearer to the truth, although he does not seem to entertain the thought that Bach may have intended to represent both images, that is, movement and the breaking of bread. And you see that this is all about deciding which is the particular pictorial image, not questioning whether that's really what's going on here in the first place. Now, Schweitzer is onto something, of course, in saying looking at a larger universe of pieces is important. And you will recognize in some of these, in some of his interpretations here, tumult, for example, is clearly Monteverdi's Concitato Genere, that stands for warlike sentiments and anger and rage and so on. And it's not hard to recognize things like pastoral topics and so on. But both considerations of the Concitato Genere and topical analysis understand that these conventions as being exactly that. They are musical conventions of the time, a shared musical language, as opposed to being some personal expressive code of Bach's. So he's not wrong to be looking at other pieces, but this pictorial bent runs all the way through analysis. The interpretation of this piece, just as an example, just goes in circles trying to decide which pictorial image is most likely. We're stuck in the same interpretive method. The way out, I suggest, and probably don't have time to elaborate on, is musical analysis that's compatible with 18th century types and with an understanding of 18th century conventions, and, importantly, willing to try and align those with theological issues that would have been understood as salient at the time. And although I don't have time to go into it, this is Alfred Durr's, the pages from Alfred Durr's analysis. And what's really interesting about it is if you write a Venn diagram of essentially all of Durr's analysis, he will tell you something about the text and the theology, and he will tell you something about the music, but they have no overlap whatsoever. I mean, they have none whatsoever. And so Durr's analyses certainly are good, and he mostly escapes this pictorial approach. But it doesn't amount to interpretation of the piece. Oh, there's lots more I could say about this, but there's a few thoughts to get us started on this topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Do either Ruth or John have a question for Dan?
I noticed at several points Dan said, they heard this or they saw this. And I think that's where this lies, the issue lies, that it's the person looking or the person listening that makes the decision. So it's therefore, to my mind, not necessarily wrong that people come to conclusions like this, because you need two halves to any artistic experience, the producer and the listener. So it's perfectly possible to hear what you want in Bach cantatas. And indeed, I would argue that a lot of the design of Bach's music is to try and make you think of something, even though one couldn't necessarily say precisely what. And what you bring to it from your background, theological or otherwise, is going to concretize what you think you're hearing. So it's Bach providing a mechanism by which pictorial, affective, or semantic issues can be constructed in the very moment of consumption.
Thank you, John. Let's move on then to Ruth on analyzing the theology.
Thank you. The theology of Bach's church cantatas, or how we got into this kind of analysis and how to get out. The past 200 years of Bach scholarship have seen a wide variety of theological views projected onto Bach's church cantatas. For example, those by Marburg and Forkel in the 18th century, by Bitter and Spitter in the 19th century, by Blume and Durr in the 20th century, and by many scholars since, including the late Martin Petzold, who recently analysed the theological in Bach research from the 1950s and named the clashing ideological camps between the theologies of scholars in West and East Germany. These theological views have been projected onto the image of Johann Sebastian Bach. We've seen Bach, the heroic representative of the German nation, Bach, the great devout Lutheran, Bach, the rigidly orthodox Lutheran, Bach, the pietist Lutheran, Bach, the begrudging, impious church musician. And with these images come many suggestions of a Bach who is implicitly anti-Semitic, anti-Muslim, anti-other, and so on. Many of these views are mutually exclusive, but they do have one common attribute. Theologically, Bach was a card-carrying Lutheran, whatever that meant in practice. Students and Bach scholars are expected to be familiar with the mainstream writings on Bach's theological beliefs. A critical look at these writings, though, show that there are as many shades of theological interpretation as there are authors. At times, emotions have run high as scholars have forcefully defended their views of Bach's theology, causing factions and divisions within the Bach community. Is it worth it? And is it even possible to discover Bach's theological stance? If historical objects such as Bach's cantatas are to speak to every age, then surely it is inevitable that we will interpret their theology from the perspectives of our own philosophy, theology, and prejudices, and thereby paint Bach the man in our own image. These are age-old questions, fundamental to the analytical aspiration, and they are part of how we got into this kind of theological analysis. So, how do we get out? The method I have chosen to try to get closer to Bach's way of thinking and his theology is a historically informed approach, focusing on sources that Bach could have known, owned, or read. It's a well-tried method, and it's particularly beneficial today because of the unlimited access we now have to historical sources that were not available to earlier scholars. This method is resulting in new insights that are both challenging and confirming the canonical views of Bach's theology. Here is an example from my work on Cantata 61. Nun komm der Heidenheiland, now come, you Saviour of the heathen. As I was thinking about this cantata, I wondered, who were the heathen to Bach? What kind of salvation did Bach think the Saviour was offering the heathen? How far did God's love, God's grace and salvation extend to the non-Lutheran other? I turned to the volumes listed in Bach's estate by theologian and Orientalist August Pfeiffer, who appears to have been one of Bach's favourite authors. The tolerance I found in Pfeiffer's theology made my heart skip a beat, given some of the hard-line views repeated in Bach literature. Here are a few examples from Pfeiffer's volume of his systematic theology, very helpful for people with a great index. So here we go. This is in translation, of course it's in German. The entire content of the gospel is found in the golden power saying of Christ, John 3:16, "For God loved the world so much that he gave his one and only Son, so that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life." Because it is in these words, in their right and complete understanding, that put before our eyes the entire evangelical sermon of grace. When Christ says, God loved the world, do not understand this to mean the enormous expanse of heavens and of earth, but rather to refer to Adam and all the children of men in the world who descended from him in the common course of nature. Not a single one is excluded. In a word, God loves the human world. Pfeiffer believed that God's love and his salvation was open to everyone, to all. And this is clarified what he meant when you read his views on the natural recognition of God. No folk or people has ever been so barbaric, wild, and crude that they lacked a sense of God, religion, or worship, or at least a shadow of these. This clearly shows that even though they did not really know what or who God was, they nonetheless recognized and were convinced in their hearts that there was a God. Later, Pfeiffer grapples with the logic of how God's love of the whole world can be squared with the salvation story. This causes him to criticize Calvinist missionary endeavors to convert indigenous people who already worshipped their own deity and believed in an afterlife. Pfeiffer, it's worth reading his comments. They're very funny, actually, but I haven't got time. Pfeiffer sees such beliefs as evidence of the merciful calling of God. he writes, "For man has a soul, which foretells of a divine judgment and another life after it. Besides, if such an American or other barbarian uses his natural light correctly and desires to know the right way of honouring God, he will have every opportunity to do so." And this is interesting. God's hand is not shortened to bring such a man to the knowledge of the truth. And we would rather trust divine goodness too much than too little, even though this is not the usual method of salvation. He pursues the logic of this position, writing, "Why then do many thousands of heathen children die before they even know left from right? The answer is, if you assume that such heathens, including Muslims and Jews, would be damned, then God would not be doing unjustly. But God in his word says that he does not want any to be damned. And in these situations, we have to trust God's righteous mercy, because God can do more in these cases than we know or understand." Throughout Pfeiffer's writings, one finds the belief that God's dispensation of grace covered all people from every corner of the world. Could this tolerant, inclusive, and kindly theology have been common currency in Bach's community? Was Pfeiffer an outlier or an exception? It seems not. The authority on post-Reformation Lutheranism, Robert D. Preuss, explains that Pfeiffer's kind of liberalism was in fact trending in the mid to late 17th century. The approach to the theological problems of their day, he writes, was not nearly as monolithic as is commonly thought. For the first time since Luther, theologians were adopting a freer attitude towards the inerrancy of Scripture, while at the same time professing fidelity to the authority of Scripture. Does this case study promise a way out or a way forward for the theological in Bach research? I think so. If Pfeiffer's brand of tolerance and his loving views of the non-Lutheran other find a place within the canon of Bach theology, they will help us hear and understand Bach's musical choices in the cantatas afresh. And that, after all, is the whole point of analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. So now, are there any questions from Dan or John for Ruth?
Could you say a little something about the word inevitable that you used early on when you said that, if I heard the word correctly, that it's inevitable we'll see this from our perspective? I suppose maybe it is in some fatalistic way, but couldn't you also ask whether one of the goals of the scholarly investigation of theology is to resist the inevitable?
Yeah, what I said was, and I agree with your point, if historical objects such as Bach cantatas are to speak to every age, then surely it is inevitable that we will interpret their theology from the perspective of our own philosophy and prejudices. Yes, it's a bit fatalistic, and yes, of course, we all fight against that because the analytical aspiration is to get beyond our own prejudices and our own views. The question is it possible? Maybe inevitable is too strong. I take your point.
Thank you for addressing it.
Yes, I mean, the whole concept of viewpoint is an interesting one because it was developed really within, partly within Leipzig, actually. I would say Martin Cladenius of the 1740s was the first hermeneut to actually suggest that different viewpoints bring different forms of understanding and interpretation, which is relatively radical for that time in history. So it's around this time that the notion of multiple viewpoints, as far as I understand it at least, becomes possible. But yet on that point of, each age colouring everything it does, you could, of course, argue that the very urge to interpret something historically correctly from a theological point of view is itself a habit of our age, and therefore we can't ever escape our shadow as such. It's just, I suppose, a question to the degree to which we can actually split our scholarly selves into a present-day self and a past-day self, and whether there really is an authentic bridge between them. And I think what you're saying there brings up this very issue, which I don't think we're going to solve this afternoon.
Thank you. And with that, we'll move right into your contribution, Dan.
Thank you. Well, I was asked to talk about performance practice, and what occurred to me is that nobody would have used the term performance practice until they actually thought about it as something they ought to be doing or thinking about. In other words, performance practice as a term suggests a consciousness of the way one performs, as opposed to performing in the way one performs, without thinking about it. And to the degree that performance practice is defined in that way, then, it's become central to Bach cantata performance since the first historically informed recordings of the entire cantatas by Harnoncourt and Leonhardt, starting in the 1960s. And essentially this became a sounding workshop for issues of Baroque historical performance and what was called at the time the authenticity movement, which of course implies that everything else is the falsity movement or the fallacious movement. What's quite interesting in contrast to what we've heard so far today is that these early pioneers, and so many of the later ones too, were surprisingly uninterested in theology or indeed much else about the cultural background apart from getting the right hardware and some of the software. It's almost as if the attitude within historical performance, at least initially, was an extension of sort of thinking of musical works as autonomous in themselves. There was almost a sort of piety of correctness in terms of performance, but not a piety in terms of the original religious or cultural needs or suggestions that these pieces of music brought. So there is an echo then of a sort of absolute music aesthetic, I think, within the early historical performance movement, which has sort of expanded to include performance and include the style of performance. The famous phrase is that if you haven't heard Mozart's piano concertos played on an original piano, you've not heard Mozart's piano concertos. Even if they're badly played, it's still better. Much of the energy that came for the movement in general came from these two key figures, Harnoncourt and Leonhardt. Neither was actually a musicologist as such, although you could sometimes be fooled into thinking they were. But I think what was so powerful about them is that they made even half-understood historical findings sound really convincing. It was the conviction that went with it. So again, a sort of religious sensibility in terms of what they were doing, thinking of what they were doing as being right. Now, the players from those days were clearly less skilled than the equivalents today, but again, the roughness itself seemed to bring a level of authenticity. We might really imagine what Bach's all-male setup must have sounded like when we hear those recordings from the 60s and 70s. The imperfection was almost a virtue, or perhaps more loftily, as some people have put it, something which demonstrates human frailty counterpoised with Bach's seeming perfection. In other words, the model of God's world as opposed to the human world of frailty, sort of shown in real time on those recordings. The biggest shock to this state of affairs, of course, came in the early 80s with the you-know-what dispute. I will not mention it. This somehow rocked the cantata world and indeed the choral world in a way that it hadn't been rocked before. If there was a suspicion that any of these new views, which are about the fact that a lot of Bach might have been performed with single singers, just in case you didn't know what must not be named, that if there was a suspicion about this, it was the fact that they might actually be partially correct at the very least. And with that suspicion came the further fear that what if we don't like the performances that Bach made? What if they anathema to what we consider to be great performance today? What if in some sense they are inadequate in the light of our changing conceptions of good performance today? Or perhaps from my point of view, more importantly, what if they destroy the very culture, the choral culture, on which Bach reception and indeed much of reception of choral music has been based? If we have to have it all down to single singers, that sort of excludes everybody rather than, as Ruth would suggest, include everybody. So there is a real fear from several different levels when this possibility was first discussed. Perhaps there are two factors that got us out of the model by which historical accuracy is the only thing that counts in Bach performance, because I think that is the problem with performance practice studies generally, is that, yes, you can only do it this way. I think the first thing that's got us out of that way of thinking, or started to get us out of that way of thinking, is that we now realise it's absurd to think that we can ever get there as such, particularly as we consider more of the context in which Bach's music and other music sounded, the presuppositions of both the players and the listeners, the smells and light levels of Bach's Weimar and Leipzig. It looked nothing like this. The sun was on gas in those days, gaslit, not electric as it is today. So as we consider ourselves to progress through time, what we consider as historical facts often change in importance, they change in quality, they change in emphasis. In other words, something looking at all the sources afresh today might come up with quite different priorities for performance and for other things besides than somebody performing the same task 20 years ago. I know this is true because I've experienced it myself. When I look at the same things again 10, 20, 30 years later, I have a different perspective. So in other words, as we change, the sources change, even though they are essentially the same, or give or take a molecule or two. In other words, there's a way that both historical knowledge, but more importantly, our own practices are in flux. We perhaps drop the idea then that there is always progress towards some hallowed, authentic performance which will suddenly bring the word of God down to all of us, and Bach will reappear resurrected somewhere in Leipzig. So in other words, if we do not aim for the notion of a single historically perfect performance, the study and interest in history can in fact carry on as an inspiring and indeed infinite driver in our quest towards regenerating our performances. We rediscover things that we didn't realise we'd forgotten, in other words. The various disputes we've had, the number of singers, how much 16-foot tone do you have, what's the cello, what type of cello do you use, how do you position the voices, important point. The role of the organ, vibrato, articulation, rhetoric, I can't remember what rhetoric was now, we've discussed it for so long, hermeneutic understanding. All these questions go on, and I believe perhaps they should. They should be refreshed on a daily, if not weekly basis. And sometimes, by taking all these things into account, they can really result in a necessary commitment to the performance. Sometimes they don't. There's nothing inevitable that performance will be better as a result of taking these things into account, but at least there's something going on which keeps us moving. So that's one thing I think that gets us out of it, the moving target idea. The second thing that gets us out of a single, correct and monolithic authentic performance is a tremendous rise in the interest in audience expectations and listening practices, both then and now. This is another moving target, all very well to start with the thought that theological connections were made by Orthodox Lutherans all the time. But what did these people think of time itself, of self, of substance, of the smell of coffee? What metaphors got them through normal life? How did an early Enlightenment rationalist hear Bach's music compared to a pietist or a Calvinist? What have you been to the opera? Did that change your view on things? Some excellent recent work has been done on embodiment and physicality in both performing and listening, and I think this really opens up the conceptions of both performance and listenings. We have an idea of the types of mindset of Bach's time, but perhaps we should also have an idea of what the body set was. How did it feel to be a person in Bach's congregation? How do we feel physically, and how do we model movement in music? So these new directions can lead towards all sorts of things. I'll be fairly quick, and I think it's quite important because a lot of these suggestions might lead to new ways of what I might call redigesting the cantata repertory. There's liturgical listening. What does it sound like in a liturgy? Either a historical one or a more modern one. What about listening that involves some degree of your audience involvement? Some of us will have experienced this week in the Nicolai cantata performances. What about hearing cantatas as part of a larger whole within a different sort of event, musical or otherwise? Hearing cantatas in different venues. I've tried cafes, I've tried nightclubs in my time. What about private listening, what you do through your earphones? And what about the cyclic ordering of communal or individual life that the cantatas bring with them? Can that rhythm, as we recreate the weeks 300 years ago, as we're doing almost now, can that give us some sort of grounding in our own experiences? So in the same way that historical performance is and was a moving target, potentially ever renewable, listening can be far more varied than the so-called authentic religious context or the anachronistic concert etiquette. The cantata's very awkwardness in the standard classical music concert canon might provide a spur towards other things that they might do for us, might have done for us in the past, and might continue to do for us in the future.
Thank you, John. So we have time for a quick question or comment from Ruth or Dan, if you have something.
I love the image of the moving target, and I think that's really what I was saying when I said it's inevitable. It was coming back to the same issue, that we, in the now, are going to be different than we even last week. And we in the future, and the tradition of acquiring something monolithic, something canonic that is correct. I think we're all challenging that, including what has been established as monolithic. All the sources, these are correct. This is, but we all know now that the interpretation has to be personal. It's become personal. I think we can accept that. So yes, in the theology, in the music, and in the performance practice, in all these areas, there is now the embodied, the real, the us, the human, a little bit more than maybe was the image put forward in the 19th century.
Yeah. Now, I know an obvious question to come out of all this is, well, surely some things are actually established fact. We know that there's this piece of paper and it has this on it. And that's absolutely true. And that's sort of scientific knowledge in a certain sense. But scientific knowledge is always, of course, correctable, repeatable and correctable. And I think that's the crucial thing to think about when we're thinking of binary yes or no answers to, well, is it a quarter note or a half note? Whatever. Or is it a particular theological point of view or another? But I think one thing that I've learned, certainly through my career, is that, yes, I still accept established facts. I'm not saying that we should not say that the order of the John Passion's many 4 or 5 performances is wrong. I think it's getting better all the time, and people like Dan have really contributed very strongly, and Michael. So it's very important to be aware of that. But I think what has changed is the weight one puts on a particular idea. So one might have a different priority as to what you think is important today, and that's where the art of both scholarship and performance and reception, I think, come into their own. So I think, yes, don't throw away the science. I'm never suggesting that, but be aware that science is iterative and ever perfectible.
Thank you, John. So is there a burning question in the audience?
The texts of the chorales in Bach's day, for example, are not fixed. And there are several instances in which there's a nasty polemical version of the chorale text and there's an updated Pfeiffer-like text. And Bach opts to go with the polemical one. That's the one that's set. in the Bach cantatas. That's a fact. I mean, that's problematic. And it's hard to reconcile with this idea that I've heard sometimes in Leipzig here too, that Bach loves everybody and that the Enlightenment is catching on. So I just give a very quick example of that too that I use quite frequently. It's often said that the Enlightenment really did finally catch on in tolerance in Leipzig over the 1730s and 40s. But the harsh technical reality, again, is that in 1734, the Passion performance in it, when they reflect on the meaning of Pilate saying, "Was ist Wahrheit?" What is truth? The commentary says, "Hör, verdammte Jude, was hier ein Heide spricht." Listen, damn Jew, to what a heathen or Gentile says to you here. And then it goes on to say, if you Jew, will not have Jesus as your king, then you can go just straight on to hell. That was what was performed as the Passion music in 1734. I heard a performance of it here at the Bachfest a few years ago, and I just about turned white when this happened. It's shocking. So I just want to throw that out as a balancing thing to think about as well. But nonetheless, I very much appreciate all the comments that have been made.
Well, I think the response to Michael requires a book. I can't. We can discuss it later. But I'm not trying to say that everything Bach wrote was ecumenical. I was really trying to discover the possible different views about the heathen. Who was the heathen? My anticipation was that the heathen, that it would be hardline, that it would be anti-Semitic, it would be, and so I was very surprised.
The it is what's important. What's the it? Is the book by Pfeiffer the it, or is the Bach vocal works the it?
Well, exactly, and that we can't know that, and of course we can't know that.
But we do know what the cantatas say.
Well, I haven't gone through all the cantatas yet to find the Pfeiffer's tolerance. Yeah, but then we also have to remember that we're coming from our own viewpoint, and you would be very right to say, as I implied, that we're coming to it from our own theologies and philosophies and prejudices, and you would be quite right to say, but Ruth, this is just appealing to you. That's why you picked this up. And of course it's why my heart skipped a beat, because I like it. And, I mean...
Check it against the repertoire.
Of course. But I was checking it in order to discuss the repertory, and so it is in my chapter about BWV 61.
Well, it is time to bring this session to a close. So I want to thank our three panelists again for their very lively and thought-provoking contributions, and we can look forward to continued conversations on this topic in the future. Thank you.